Welcome to How the World Works, a podcast where we talk about work. This is a special edition coming to you live from lovely Bar Harbor, Maine. We are at the Competitive Enterprise Institute's annual Policy Summit. And I'm Kevin Williamson. I'm a writer-in-residence here at CEI, and this is a podcast where we talk about work. So sometimes that means talking about our jobs and the jobs that we've had and the jobs we might like to do. And sometimes it means talking about work, what work means in our lives. And sometimes it means talking about policy things related to work. And we have a special guest today. I like to get outside of the world of DC people, right? Because all my friends are like libertarian journalists and policy think tank people and stuff like that. And those are the easiest people to get on the podcast. And so we probably have too many of those. But we do like to get some people on from time to time who have real jobs. And I'm not sure you have a real job. You're a certified Maine guide, among other things, and someone who has made a career and a life in the outdoors and in recreational life and in tourism and hospitality and things like that. So this is Matthew Polstein, who owns a lot of things here, actually. And I was thinking a couple of hotels, a couple of restaurants, a lot of different investments, and started off. Was it kayaking or was it whitewater rafting?
I started as a kayaker, and that got me into whitewater rafting, which was where my business started.
Right. So why don't you tell people about your business and what it is and what you do and how you got started in it? I think it's an interesting story.
Sure, love to. But first, let me welcome you to the great state of Maine. You're here on the coast. I live and work inland, not too far from here in the Katahdin region. Maine is a big, beautiful state with a bold coastline and some incredible interior mountains, and I urge you all to get out and enjoy it. My business started, and not to take the DC piece out of it, I did actually spend a year living in Alexandria. My father worked for the Foreign Service, so don't look for me to have a good Maine accent. I have the DC melting pot accent for a conversation today. But my business started with me having a passion for canoeing and kayaking and paddling whitewater on Maine's beautiful whitewater rivers. And that led me to start what initially was a largely whitewater rafting and canoe and kayak company paddling 3 Maine rivers.
And what I like about your business story is that you sort of bootstrapped the whole thing. So you started off with this very kind of small business doing rafting guiding. And then you took some of the money from that and you bought a cabin, then you had another cabin, and now you've got this whole thing. So why don't you tell people about the larger empire that you built up there in Kentucky?
Bootstrap is I'd say it's a fair statement. When my father left the Foreign Service, he became a professor, and both my parents were educators. And in 1982, I was working on the rivers in Maine for another rafting company and realized that the regulatory structure was going to close access to the river off. And if I didn't jump in quickly, I wouldn't have a chance to start a business on one of Maine's beautiful rivers. And I went about trying to scratch together the money to make that work. I was enrolled in college at that time, and I said to my parents, I'm going to take a year off from school and focus on starting a rafting business. And my father graciously offered me the $8,000 he'd set aside for college to help fund the start of the business. So he was my first lender. We capitalized the company, a partner and I, with about $24,000, bought 4 or 5 rafts and started running raft trips, and grew very quickly in the middle of an industry that was growing quickly at the time. Lucky for us, we realized that diversifying from just running whitewater rivers was an important strategy for us. There were about a dozen companies rafting in Maine, and we all ran the same stretch of river. So to try to differentiate, we started building amenities to support our product, guest houses. We bought an old inn, we bought an old hotel with a bar in it, and it made us more competitive, having a more diversified product. But it also led to us needing to take on more debt, borrow more money, and that sort of fueled a cycle of demand, need, and growth that we've been working in ever since.
So you were about, 20 when you started this?
I was 20 when I started the business.
And there's this kind of a course of life that a lot of people imagine for themselves, for their kids. And you go to high school, you go to college, you come out of college, and you get a job that requires a college degree. Your father worked for government, and you were in Iran at one point, right, as a little kid?
I was. When I was a month old, we went to Tabriz, Iran, and then Turkey for 4 years, where my father was stationed.
And were you involved in the revolution at that age, or?
It was a little early for me, back at that 1 month stage.
Were your parents very resistant to the idea of you dropping out of college? So I know a lot of people who've told this story. And Michael Dell tells this story about wanting to take a year off from school or 2 years off from school to start a business. And if I remember Dell's story right, he was building computers in his dorm room at the University of Texas, and he told his dad he wanted to take a year off and try to start a computer company. His father said, "Well, how much money could you possibly be making building computers in your dorm room?" And he said, like $396,000 last year, like 1985 or something. Oh, we'll do it then. But you didn't have a huge revenue stream to show to your parents. You were academics and probably people who really very highly valued education. Were they very resistant to the idea of you taking time out?
I think at first they were horrified, to tell you the truth, and really couldn't believe that I would abandon that sort of traditional path of pushing through college. I think they ultimately came to the conclusion that this was something I needed to get out of my system, and that if they helped get me through that first year, by the next year I'd be back in college. Well, that never happened, and sadly my father passed away just a few years later, so he never got to see the growth and success that I ultimately had following that different path.
So walk me through the kind of steps of growth of the business. So you sort of sketched it out in sort of more general terms earlier, but like how do you actually make the move from just doing river guiding to the other things? Was it just you just wait until you have enough money in your checking account to start with the next thing, or?
It's really a story of place. There are two major rivers in Maine that people run. There are three that we run, but two that have most of the traffic, the Kennebec and the Penobscot. And we built a substantial business over on the Kennebec River initially. And the Penobscot River, which is up by a big state park called Baxter State Park with the state's tallest mountain, was sort of our secondary place of operation. Once we'd established ourselves in the Kennebec, we went to the Penobscot to try to catch up, if you will, start building amenities there. And we found actually that we didn't have the funding or the energy to sort of grow both places at the same time. And we made a decision that was vastly different from anyone else in our industry. And that was that the Penobscot was the better river. And that location had more diversification opportunities for us. It was a more spectacular setting for us to grow our business. And so we found an old set of camps called Twin Pine Camps that was on a lease on a lake. All that land was owned by a paper company, Great Northern Paper, who owned 2.1 million acres of land in the state at that point. And there was almost no other business in the area. The paper company was the dominant player, creating great jobs. The town was known as the town that paper made. It had the highest per capita income and the lowest housing costs in the state. It was really a wonderful place to be at that time, the early 80s. So we sort of nuzzled our way in, not necessarily with the enthusiasm of the paper company who was trying to build a dam on the river we were rafting. So there was a little controversy going on there. But we nuzzled our way into the area and started to build a relationship with the community. And really, our business took off more, not just with the rafting, which actually started to decline after the year 2000, but in the hospitality side with the resort that has 21 cottages on the lake, as you mentioned, a couple of restaurants, a wedding venue or activity center. And, we've grown as the town has continued to transition away from paper.
At some point, you must have been thinking to yourself, our business would be healthier and more profitable if this town had some restaurants or if it had more accommodations, and no one's building them. And so you end up essentially doing it yourself as a kind of, not only as an independent business, but as a strategy for making a stronger overall kind of business environment in which your business can thrive.
That's very true. I mean, again, to put these towns, Millinocket, East Millinocket, in perspective, in 1900, there was no one living there, like population 5. And a enterprising group came and said, this is a perfect place to build a mill. Within a year, there were 1,000 people in there. And then the mill literally built the biggest paper mill in the United States. They built the largest private hydroelectric system in the world. And they built the communities. They laid out the streets. They poured people's foundations. And within a few years, there were thousands of people living there. And it was a bustling metropolis all centered around cutting trees and making paper. When I arrived, the paper making was in decline, but the community had been set up solely to support it. So there were hotels and motels, but they were in town and they were designed for business travelers. They weren't out where this beautiful natural setting was, on lakes looking at mountains where people would be happier to stay. If you were coming to sell a $100,000 piece of felt for a paper machine, it was fine to stay in a hotel in town. But if you were coming to stay for a week, being out closer to that beautiful natural resource became important. And we saw that. I think nobody else that lived in the community really thought about it because everything they needed was coming out of the paper mill.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of communities go through this very familiar story of having essentially one dominant business that for one reason or another goes into decline, or sometimes slowly, sometimes quite suddenly. Sometimes technological change or other kinds of economic changes will essentially just take an industry out in a very short period of time. And this is an example of a success story, of course, of a community being able to make transition. And that's always a happy story, but it's not a frictionless story. And there is, of course, the trees are a rivalrous resource, right? There are people who want to cut them down to make paper out of them. There are people who want the wilderness to remain more or less untouched and use it as a recreational resource. And there's a sense of competition there that if, yes, our community needs something else, but we're not really entirely sure we want this other thing going on. And I know that's been a bit of an issue where you are, particularly when it came to the designating some land as a national monument. I know that was something you were involved in. Could you talk maybe just a little bit about that, about how these two industries sort of not always were in complete harmony, but also in some ways were both working together for the good of the community. And the paper industry, of course, is still there. It hasn't gone away entirely. These things are things that still live side by side economically in the community.
You raise an interesting point and ask an interesting question. I find that the paper industry, and to be fair, in our two towns, our paper mills are gone. We do not make paper anymore. We still cut trees. And the timber industry, different from the paper industry, is an incredible part of our economy. It's a huge driver for the whole state of Maine, and it's very, very important to the area I'm in. Unfortunately, when we first started rafting, as I mentioned earlier, we rafted on a river that had a dam on it, and that dam was going through relicensing, and we were at odds with the mill owner over how it should be run. Regulatory issue, something you're all very interested in. And we got a seat at the table. We talked about how that dam was run, and then we had a more contentious fight when they sought to build a brand new dam on the river, which ultimately didn't happen. But we saw values in that river that were different from those of the people that were making paper or wanted to generate electricity with a hydropower facility in what we felt was an incredibly unique resource for the state of Maine that had other value that in the long run could provide both economy and sort of social solace for people of the area. So we weren't always well received in sort of preaching this tourism can be an enabler. We can help your mills succeed, or we can help the next business that comes to town and your industrial park succeed by making this area a more attractive area to live. And you mentioned a national monument. There's long been an effort in the state of Maine to build a large national park. And I've never been a supporter of that. It would have taken the sort of center of the breadbasket of wood fiber, either for paper or timber or our wood products industry, sort of out of play. And we can't afford to give that much land up for a national park in the state of Maine. But a more reasonable proposal for park or monument came about by a woman named Roxanne Quimby, who'd acquired about 85,000 acres of land and was looking to create a block of about 150,000 acres of land.
She was a co-founder of Burt's Bees.
She was,
okay.
Yeah. And she wanted.
And sounds like kind of an interesting character. Like they moved up there to a place with no plumbing or electricity and stuff, and lived like in a
very true
in a shack with an outhouse when they were building what ended up becoming this kind of household name company.
That's correct. Yeah, quite an amazing story. But anyway, she'd acquired land in our area, and there was opposition to it becoming federally owned. A lot of people in our area were nervous about the federal government coming in and having a bigger say in how decisions were made around different things in our area. And it took years of working with the community. Roxanne's son, a fellow named Lucas St. Clair, who's a friend of mine, took over the effort, and he said, I've had literally, thousands of cups of coffee sitting in people's houses talking about how tourism and then, the preservation of a small piece of natural resources can work hand in hand with broader economic development for this area. And ultimately, we were successful in that effort.
It's an interesting kind of policy problem. It's sort of eminent non-domain. We're used to dealing with cases of the federal government wanting to take people's land and maybe undercompensate them for it and do things with it. This was a case of someone who owned the land and wanted to give it away, and her efforts to give away her own land were pretty energetically resisted in a lot of quarters.
Right. That's made even more ironic by the fact that all the land she bought from people that owned it as timberland and cut wood and sold wood to the paper company. And so at fair market timber values, she acquired this land because it was more difficult land to harvest. It wasn't considered the best of the best, but it had incredible ecological values and historical values. This land is where Teddy Roosevelt sort of cut his teeth as a young man, hiking Katahdin and hunting and fishing in the Maine woods. And so there was reason to set it aside for the broader public and for Roxanne to come in with her own money and acquire it, not seek someone taking it from anybody, all willing buyer, willing seller arrangements. Ultimately, I think we were able to convince people that that was an okay thing, that the federal government wasn't going to come in and take more. They haven't taken land by eminent domain around national monuments or parks in a long, long time. So,
yeah, the issues surrounding economic development in communities like yours are pretty interesting to me, because places that are sparsely populated and don't have a lot of other resources, it's difficult to kind of get things jump started. A lot of people don't know this story, but before Detroit was a kind of declining automaking city, a million years ago, it was a declining city where they had made marine engines and boat parts. And one of the reasons the automobile industry was successful in Detroit was because they already had a labor pool there of engineers and machinists and people like that who knew how to make motors and how to assemble things like that. So the car business, when it ended up taking off in the early 20th century, was kind of a natural fit. Another place that I've written about a lot is Eastern Kentucky, which has, in some ways similar to where you are, very rural, sparsely populated. There had been, some industry there in the form of coal mining and some other manufacturing that declined and went away over the years. And then it's being sort of a chicken and the egg kind of problem where people don't want to move there because there are no jobs, but then businesses don't really want to invest there because there's not a workforce. And so for the people who already are there, it becomes a really difficult thing to do. So you must have some interesting problems, I think, related to recruiting labor and staffing jobs and things like that. And of course, yours, I imagine there must be some considerable share of your work must be seasonal. I would guess you're probably not as busy in the winters as you are in the rest of the world. So what is it like trying to get people to be there and to find workers and to fill those positions?
Well, again, that's been another story of transformation in our area. When I moved to town in the early 80s, the mill hadn't hired anyone for years. And so there were a lot of empty houses in town and the population was in decline. You could buy houses when I first moved to town for $40,000 or $50,000. Then the mill went bankrupt, closed briefly, and opened back up. Now you could buy houses for $20,000. And about the time that we were looking at acquiring, when we first moved there, we were on a 7-acre leasehold. In 2007, we acquired 1,450 acres of land around that leasehold and broadened our interest from just running recreational trips to basically being in the resort development and real estate business. And we were asked at the time that we were rezoning land for that, would we provide employee housing? And we said it would be a disservice to the community if we built employee housing out here when there are hundreds of empty houses in Millinocket that young families could move into for small money and help revitalize the town. And the regulators agreed with us, and that's the way sort of things moved forward. Well, as the pandemic came along, house values slowly grew, but not by much. But when the pandemic came along, our community became, like many rural communities, a highly sought after community. And you'll laugh, the housing values rose to like the $130,000, $140,000 range. So you could buy a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch for $140,000 in my town.
Up from 5 or 6 or 7,000.
Yes. Yeah. So people did. And we went from having 150 empty houses to having none. You couldn't find a house anywhere. Out where I am on the lake, property values went from, a small camp on the lake. The first one I ever bought, I paid $20,000 for a camp and a lot of land. That camp and lot of land would be worth about $350,000, $400,000 now. And that's that change is driving a lot of other change in our area at this point. But back to your original question about staffing, we're now in a position where we're looking at building employee housing as a way that we can differentiate ourselves in the employee market for good people that come from all over the world. And I think all over the U.S. and all over the world looking for work. I think that's a really important distinction that needs to be made. You know, in the early 80s, we looked to recruit kids from Maine, and that's about as far as they travel. But now people in our industry and all industries can live and work virtually anywhere. They can, if there's good internet, they can set up shop. And so we have an area that now has good fiber, good internet. We have incredible natural resources. We've been building single track mountain bike trails. We've got world-class whitewater. We've got incredible fishery. Baxter State Park, Katahdin Woods and Waters have hundreds of miles of beautiful hiking trails. And so we're trying to make affordable housing available for young people that want to be in a beautiful place with those recreational amenities, both for our business and for other businesses that are now looking to come into the old mill site in town.
And this is an enormous problem in some other communities that are really developed around particularly outdoor recreation. We talked earlier about the case of Aspen is kind of maybe the gold standard example of how you don't want to go about addressing this problem, where the last time I checked in, I wrote a story about it. You were eligible for low-income housing subsidies there at an income of up to, I think, $370,000 a year or something. And you can't live there on $370,000 a year. It's outrageously expensive. It's the most expensive, per square foot place in the United States. And so you end up with this problem of people having to commute hours to work, which is difficult in places where it snows a lot, like Colorado and Maine. We're not talking about Southern California where you can, drive 2 hours and maybe the traffic stinks, but it's not dangerous and difficult to do. When you look at other places that have developed around a recreational industry model, particularly outdoor stuff, what do you think are sort of good examples? I'd like our place to look more like this. What are the bad examples? I'd like our place to not look like that. And what are the considerations that go into that for you?
Well, first, look no further than Bar Harbor for a community that's a wonderful place to visit that's now faced with challenges for housing employees because everybody wants to not only visit but live here. This area is really struggling, grappling. Businesses like the one that supports the conference you're having have bought small hotels, shut them down, and made them employee housing. They've bought houses left and right to house people, their workforce for the summer here. And we don't want that. We don't want to get that bad. So in my case, I'm fortunate in that I have that 1,400 acres of land. Some of it has great views, some of it less so. And so there's plenty of room for me to invest as part of my success strategy in providing good housing for my employees. And I think where people have that opportunity, that's going to be important to do. And the more preemptively you can do it before land values really explode in beautiful areas, the better. As far as a model goes, there are other issues in my area that are interesting, and Moab offers an interesting model for comparison in that we're a community that has a lot of people that look at quiet, nature bathing, solitude, hiking, cross-country skiing. We're also a community that has a big ATV crowd. We cater to snowmobilers in the winter. They're 80% of my business in the winter. So we've got a mix of motorized and non-motorized. And I've been to Moab and love the fact that you've got, national parks, national monuments. You've got a Superfund site right in the middle of town. And you've got bikers, hikers, Jeepers, ATVers, they're all getting along well. They're all well served in discrete, distinct places where they recreate individually. So it's multiple use, but it's not all multiple use on the same land, same place. It's sort of categorically spread out. There are places where they have common access trails and things, but some good planning is going on there. And I think that's a good model for us to look at.
I guess seasonality is a help there too. There are a lot of people probably kayaking while people are also cross-country skiing. It seems like those probably wouldn't go together.
Fair statement, although we do have people that kayak in the middle of the winter. Not many, but some.
Are they Canadians?
Excuse me?
Are they Canadians?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course, yeah. Very good. One of the interesting things about your story is I think you've really reached the point in your career that a lot of people do reach at a certain level of business success where you're really very focused on developing your community, and not just out of public spiritedness, although it seems to certainly be an element of that, but because you realize that for you at this point, the success of your community and the success of your business are deeply interrelated. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how those two things go together for you?
when I first moved to Millinocket, I made the observation that there was a tension between the conservation community and clearly the paper mills. But there was also a tension between the conservation community and my business, the tourism industry. I viewed myself as a conservationist, and there were people in the conservation world that thought I was a horrible developer. And I was trying to figure out how to reconcile those issues. One of the things that sort of came to my mind was that hungry people make poor conservationists. And so in the case of the mill's decline, people wouldn't prioritize the protection of these beautiful resources that were there that could be protected in a way that would support the mill, but also protect it. All they cared about was the success of the mill because they were worried about losing their jobs and there was no other opportunity. And I think as our town evolves and develops, keeping people focused on the idea that taking care of the resources around the town, managing them in a sustainable fashion is good business. It's not just good for the environment. It's good business. And that's the philosophy that we try to demonstrate and teach with my company. We're committed to having a gentle footprint on the earth because the earth is what drives my business. So we have built our own solar arrays. We net meter most of our business. Our building style of late has been passive house focused. So, I live in a house that's connected to the grid, but it's only for convenience. If I wanted to disconnect it from the grid, I could disconnect it in a heartbeat. I produce more power every year in my house than my house uses.
So when the zombie apocalypse comes, we should all come hang out with you.
What was that?
When the zombie apocalypse finally gets here, we're coming to Maine.
They'd have to climb a big hill to get to my house, and I'm not sure they have that much ambition.
Gotcha. What is a Maine guide? I hear this term used all the time, but I've never actually known what a Maine guide is.
It's so in the state of Maine, initially to be a hunting or fishing guide, you had to license with our Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And to get that license, you had to take a written test, but you also had to take an oral test with 2 game wardens and a civilian that were on a board that you sat down before. And when I became a whitewater guide in the early 80s, I had to sit before that same civilian board. 2 game wardens, law enforcement folks, dark glasses inside a room, and a civilian who grilled me on numerous questions. Lucky for me, in a way, they didn't know a lot about whitewater, and I was trying to be licensed under a category called a recreation guide, which was the only license they had that they could sort of pigeonhole rafting into. And so I need to know about how to load a canoe, to run whitewater. They had a trick question, which was, how do you make salmon chowder? And I'd been coached that the answer was, you don't. It's too good a fish to make chowder out of. So I passed that test. You had to orient a map and compass. Anyway, my point is, it's actually a very arduous course. The written test is difficult, orienting the map, having this, they have what they used to call the lost hunter scenario. Now it's just the lost person scenario. They give you a scenario that you have to articulate how you're going to respond to it. It's over an hour. And again, these are tough Maine wardens staring at you, asking you tough questions, and you either pass or fail based on their whim, really, at the end of it. So as a result, people that got that license, particularly for hunting and fishing, became known worldwide as being really good people at hunting and fishing with real knowledge and a strong capacity to take good care of you if they brought you out into the out of doors. And that has held true to this day for all of the licenses. That there's now, a sea kayaking Maine guide, a whitewater Maine guide, the recreation guide, which covers canoeing, snowmobiling, hiking. It's a red patch. It's a badge. And people wear it with pride. And if you go to Alaska and say, I want to work in a hunting camp, and tell them you're a registered Maine guide, they're going to hire you. If you go anywhere in the world and tell them you were a registered Maine guide, brings a lot of credibility to the table.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in this room, myself included, who have some strong opinions about occupational licensing and whether it's a very good thing. But I do kind of like some of the traditions that go along with this stuff. And what that really reminds me of is the famous London taxi driver examination known as the knowledge. And you have to be able to navigate to any point in the city. Just from your own memory without any consulting GPS or anything like that. And compared to New York, where everything is every taxi is driven by a guy with GPS who's never been to New York before and doesn't know where City Hall is or doesn't know where Central Park is. There's something to be said for the kind of old-fashioned way of having people who have real, deep, sort of organic expertise in things, and I do like that. We were talking a little bit about community development and community focus, And at what point in your career did you really get to the point where you started to really understand the way in which these two things were really intertwined? Because I know being a developer, which is essentially, mainly what you are these days, the developer's natural state of being is low-level terror, because there's so much debt and personal exposure involved in being a real estate developer. You've always resisted having partners. You financed your business with bank loans and not taken outside investors and things like that. So there must have been times in your life when you've really been on the hook for some borrowing that you've had to do to expand your business, and there must have been some sleepless nights for that. And so you go through a lot of your career mainly thinking about, what am I doing with my business and myself and my income and my net worth and all that. But at a certain point, I think a lot of people, particularly very successful people, start to realize the ways in which these relationships are less discreet than you think. That we really are bound up in one another's success in ways that are obvious and non-obvious. I wonder if you could just maybe speak about that a little bit.
In 2008, I mentioned earlier, I bought a big piece of land in 2007. And in 2008, I permitted a doubling of the bed base of the camps that I had. And it was more than a doubling of my debt. And most of you will remember in 2008 and 9, the financial world was starting to shake a little bit. In 2009, it kind of tanked. And so we doubled our debt, doubled our bed base, and grew 10% the next year. And this was traditional bank financing with a little bit of support from another CEI, Coastal Enterprises, Inc., which is a state nonprofit that helps. They provided a little bit of leverage in my financing with some subordinated debt. Anyway, long story short, we hung on by our fingernails for a few years after that. And I have to say, I'd been fairly fearless when it came to borrowing money. And to your point, I think my fearlessness was driven out of the fact that I was single or recently married without children. I'd arrived with my belongings in the backseat of my car. And I still, at this point, though I owned a lot of real estate, had the feeling that I could leave with my belongings in the backseat of my car and life would be okay. After living through that, and it literally took us 4 years.
I bet it's a better car now.
Excuse me?
I bet it's a better car now.
Yeah, yeah. It took us 4 years to sort of climb out of that financial hole. I realized that I had more people depending on me. My community cared about the success of my business at this point. We had 30 or 40 employees who had children, families, mortgages that required a paycheck. And stability started to become a more important issue. And I think from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it takes a little bit of the wind out of your sail, because you're not just doing it for yourself anymore. You're doing it for a broader community. And that's, in some ways, that slowed us down. When I moved to Millinocket in 1995, we were about $1 million company, and it's taken us a long time, but we're about a $5.5 million company now, about 55 full-time employees. And we're still borrowing and we're still growing. We're in the middle of actually a big growth phase coming right up with a regulatory approval we hope to get for a subdivision in the month of June, this month. So,
how much of your life has been dealing with regulators?
Lately, quite a bit. I'm in what's known, you'll chuckle at this, I'm in the part of the state of Maine that's known as the unorganized territory, meaning we have no local government. So in some ways, that's wonderful. There's no building inspector. There is a plumbing and an electrical inspector, but I seldom see them. But we are regulated by something called the Maine Land Use Planning Commission, which regulates development in the unorganized territory. And it was originally set up to basically protect the timber industry in the 70s. Its mandate was largely to keep development out of the unorganized territories, the forested fringe and in of the state of Maine. There's also a Department of Environmental Protection agency in the state of Maine, state agency, and they regulate municipalities, but they also regulate growth in the unorganized territory when it reaches a certain size. So I've had the good fortune of arriving at that space where I'm regulated by both now. I have to permit with the Land Use Planning Commission and the DEP, and I've been working on that for the last 2.5 years. I find them generally to be supportive agencies to work with in the state of Maine. I think they've now accepted that there's a level of growth that needs to happen in order for the state's economy to work. They have rules. We understand those rules. We follow those rules. We try to build our permitting in such a way that it meets the goals and objectives of those rules. And if I get a permit in June, I'll feel like we were successful.
Yeah, I've written a lot about the oil and gas industry. And one thing I found, certainly in Texas, but also in Pennsylvania and other places I've written about, is that local businesses there and national companies that work in those markets have a much easier time working with the state level DEPs and state level regulators than they do with the EPA and the federal authorities. And part of that is federalism kind of works, but also I think it's really a matter of information where there are better and worse models of regulation, and regulators that are closer to the business and closer to the community who understand the economic needs and incentives and trade-offs better tend to be more responsive and more reasonable and less ideological, less rigid sometimes and things. Has that also been your experience that you probably don't have a lot of need to work with federal authorities, although I imagine that comes up from time to time?
Well, I mentioned earlier, we do have our arm in that we float our rafts down rivers that are under dams that are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So 4 times in my life, I've been through the process of relicensing of dams, twice on the Kennebec, twice on the Penobscot River. And so those processes take years. And I would say with what I would consider the current state of disarray in Washington, we're in the middle of a relicensing on the Penobscot right now, and I think it's going to take more years than it normally takes because people have left the federal energy in my case, I deal on the recreation side of opportunity below those dams, and the person that's been there for many, many years has just left, and there's no one that's been brought in to fill that job. So I'm worried about where does this process go? How much longer is this multi-year process going to be now? We don't tend to see that on the state level. I find on the state level that, we do well by doing good. And again, I think generally our rules in the state of Maine are aimed at, my apologies if you couldn't hear that, are aimed at affecting good policy. And so if we understand that and follow the guidance, it hasn't been a problem locally. It's a little more abstract on the national level.
Yeah. I'm originally from Texas, and one of the things about local culture in Texas is that Texans have this very, very strong opinion that Texas is different from the rest of the country. And I think the way in which it's most different is by how focused they are on being different from the rest of the country. It's sort of a recursive loop, but the states really are different. And Maine really is kind of an unusual place. It definitely has its own distinct culture. It's in some ways, it reminds me of Louisiana a little bit in that it's got a bit more the French influence. And how is Maine different as a place to work and invest and do business than say, Massachusetts or the rest of New England?
Well, everybody in the state of Maine if you live and work in the state of Maine. I know the governor. I know many of the people in the legislature. I live in a little rural town in northern Maine, but it's not unusual to be on a first-name basis with the people that you deal with at a fairly high level of regulation and oversight from within your state. You learn, and I come to Washington, D.C. We have a great group of people representing us in Washington with strongly different perspectives and opinions. Senator Collins, Senator King. I consider them both friends. They eat at my restaurant. When you live and work in the state of Maine, you get to know people, and you lose apprehension or bashfulness about dealing with issues. You deal with them head on, straight on. You have a challenge, you have a problem, you pick up the phone, you fly to Washington, you drive to Augusta, and you talk to the people that are in a position to work with you on it. Generally, they want to work with you. So I think that's a difference in Maine. It's it's not just that we're a small 3.4, 3.5 million person state where you actually get to know everybody that is active. It's a sort of Yankee commitment to supporting and working working with and understanding your neighbors. We all rely on each other, and we all try to support each other.
Where do you think culturally that comes from? This sort of quasi-Scandinavian thing, this sort of sense of social solidarity.
Well, Yankee independence, the need to solve your own problems. When I bought this camp on Millinocket Lake, I lived over on the Kennebec River, and I quickly realized that the physical condition of the camp, which had been run down, was such that it needed a lot of attention and work, and I couldn't afford to hire someone to do it. And often in Maine, that's the case. You can't necessarily afford to hire a lobbyist. You go to Augusta, you lobby for yourself. So there's a strong desire, I think, in this state to solve your own problems or to work with your neighbors to solve your problems. And for the most part, if we have political differences, if we have practical differences, we're generally willing to sit down and talk about ways to build bridges and solve those problems. It's a good metaphor for the world. I wish more people would pay attention to it.
Well, that's just what I was thinking. It's not just Maine that's full of people who need to learn to solve their own problems. It's every other place as well. But for some reason, it seems to work out maybe a little better here than it does some other places.
I haven't lived everywhere, so I don't know whether this is true or not in other places, but you can have a neighbor you don't get along with, but if their house burns down, you let them come stay in your house. That's the way we do business in the state of Maine. We're great at, if there's a crisis, we're great at rallying together, no matter who the people are or what the issue is, to support them in the face of that crisis. And I think that, that commitment to your neighbor, to being neighborly, it's why people love Maine. It's why they feel good when they come here. They can, a funny anecdote. As new people moved into my town, this woman, Mary Alice, moved to my town, and I was talking to her one day, and she said, I moved here because the first time I came here, I walked into the grocery store, and I walked through the checkout, and the checkout lady said to me, you're new in town, aren't you? And I said, yes, it's my first day here. And she said, well, what's your name? Next time I went to the grocery store, the woman at the checkout counter knew my name and said, you're back. It's your second visit. And she said, I've lived in a town for 20 years and no one at the grocery store knows who I am. And again, that can be the way Maine treats you. You will tend to find happy, positive people on the street, in our stores, in our service-centered businesses that are happy to have you here and happy to interact with you.
Yeah. So the difference is in Washington, if someone's house burns down after a political disagreement, you're pretty sure that guy's the one who burned your house down.
Well, that can happen here too. That can be more of there's a saying in Maine, when people are mad at you, they'll say, I'll turn your property into a blueberry barren, which basically means I'll burn everything off it. And all you'll be left to do is grow blueberries. But it doesn't tend to happen that often.
That's a great thread, by the way. I will turn your life into a blueberry patch, because it sounds kind of nice. But it's nice. I'm gonna write that one down. One last thing I did want to ask you about that I meant to ask you about earlier, back to a kind of more specific question. You have some, I guess, some concerns or work you've done with the downtown area of Millinocket, where you live, that's still in need of some improvement, you think. Talk a little bit about that. That sort of is a very rural area, but kind of an urban development problem in the middle of it.
Sure. So again, town that paper made. It's Main Street, Penobscot Avenue was it almost looked like a Western sort of stockyard facade type street. But most of the businesses closed in the 80s and 90s when the mill's population declined and you could buy everything you needed online or drive to Bangor to a big box store to pick up what you needed. So the street looked really run down. And there was a foreclosure auction on what I had always thought was the most attractive building on the street. It was a brick building, 2-story, 5,000 square foot footprint, 10,000 square foot building. And it went up for auction. And to give you an idea how bad real estate values were, I bid $5,300 and I was the only bidder, left a lot of money on the table. So I bought that building for $5,000, which was less than the back taxes that were due on it. And we fixed it up, and we did it not because we thought it was a deal. Honestly, at the time that I paid $5,000 for it, I wondered if I'd ever get the money back. It was that bleak in Millinocket, but we did it because we wanted to put something in the first floor storefront. We wanted to light that facade up at night. So we worked with a local photographer, and we basically made a little art gallery out of it that sold sundry items. We sold local beer, wine, cheeses that were made locally. And we ended up selling a half interest in the business to a friend of mine who recovers sunken pulpwood, which was the wood that they drove down the rivers to make paper out of a lake with a crane. And he makes products out of that sunken pulpwood. So we took this dark building and we lit it up, and we refurbished the facade and changed the windows and added a little bit of life to Main Street. And since then, more and more people have been coming to buy small buildings on Main Street and fix them up and actually put something in them. There's a building that's probably 25 or 30 feet across the front, 50 feet deep, that's on the market right now for $200,000. A little different from my $5,000 building, and still a deal if any of you are looking for good real estate. But we felt very strongly that because we were outside of town and a lot of activity was going on at our property outside of town, we needed to make a commitment to downtown to try to help them be more attractive. And, again, I'm not doing the town a favor. It's good for my business. it's the right thing to do for the community. And if the downtown is more attractive to people, people will stay longer. My business will prosper. I'm a big fan of the concept of a rising tide lifts all ships. It doesn't lift them all equally. Sometimes people need a little help. But if we can keep the tide coming in, then people with a little bit of support can make other things work. You mentioned earlier, tourists, they want diversity. They want multiple restaurants. I now own 2. I'm a reluctant restaurateur, trust me. The restaurant business is a bad business to be in, but we own 2. We started a brewery. We have an event center that can handle weddings for 150 people. Food service is now 50% of my business. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did.
No salmon chowder on the menu, though.
Yeah, yeah. No salmon chowder. Nope.
It occurs to me that I didn't say the name of your business when I was introducing you, and now that I'm in front of a crowd, I've forgotten it.
Say that again?
So it occurs to me I didn't say the name of your business when I was introducing you, and now they were in front of a crowd, I blanked on it.
It's NEOC, or NEOC, which is formed from a rebranding from the New England Outdoor Center. We're an outdoor recreation resort at this point, and most of our business is in the hospitality side. We feed you well, we give you comfortable places to sleep, and we support that with great activities, watchable wildlife tours. We take people out to look for moose. We take them whitewater rafting. We teach them cross-country skiing. We run an educational program that introduces about 3,000 students a year to canoeing, kayaking, biking, or cross-country skiing in partnership with a nonprofit called the Butler Conservation Fund. So we're active in our area, and we find that our guests largely want solitude and beauty and good food and maybe a good cocktail to go with it and a nice bed to sleep in, and we're happy to provide that for them.
So if I want to see a moose, you're my guy.
Say that again?
If I want to see a moose, you're my guy.
I'm sorry.
Say if I want to see a moose, you're the guy to see.
Absolutely. Sorry about that. And if you want to see a moose, this is the time of year to do it. From late May to the middle of July, we have almost 100% success rate, taking you out by van, by canoe. We have a nice pontoon boat that we float around a beautiful lake in, and it's a good habitat for moose in the back of the lake. We see them almost every day.
We're a little over time, but I have to ask this question. Why is this a good time of year to see moose? What changes in the moose's life?
There are a number of factors. One is a negative, and that is where we live, and thankfully it's not the case here, it's black fly season. So we have these little biting flies that if the moose are deep in the woods, they're getting bit a lot. If they're up to their neck in water, they're only getting bitten from the neck up. So they spend time in water literally to get away from the flies. Second, water bodies in our area have something called pondweed that grows in it, which is that little wispy, thin green weed that grows up from the bottom, and it has salt in it. So moose go there seeking sodium, which they can't get in many other places. So they literally eat off the bottom of the pond. And third, moose, they stay warm very easily, they cool off slowly, and they get overheated quickly. So they love going in cold water because it keeps their temperature. Between the food, getting away from the flies, and being calm and relaxed, they're happy to be in the water eating, and that's where we go to see them.
This is a podcast about very specific industry knowledge, so I'm glad we got that one out of there. Matthew, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed the conversation.
It's been a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you for having me.